There is a morning that millions of people have experienced, and almost none of them were prepared for it. It arrives sometime in the first week of retirement. You wake up, perhaps earlier than you intended, out of old habit, and for a moment you lie still, and something feels wrong. Not painful, not dramatic, just off. The morning has a different quality to it. There is nowhere you are supposed to be. No meeting, no shift, no task waiting on a screen somewhere. The day ahead is open in a way that, at first, feels exactly like freedom. And then, slowly, a quieter feeling moves in. A kind of blankness. Not quite sadness, but something in that direction. The feeling of reaching for a wall that is not there anymore. For most of your adult life, work organized everything. It told you when to wake up, where to go, what to think about, how to spend your energy, who you were in the world. It gave you a calendar, a role, a routine, and a name, or something close to one. Because when someone asked, as adults always ask, what do you do? There was an answer, a clear and immediate answer. And that answer, whether you loved your work or merely endured it, gave you a place in the understood order of things. Now it doesn't. And here is the thing that catches most people off guard. The question does not disappear with the work. If anything, it gets louder. Who are you when the work is gone? This is not a question that retirement planning addresses. The financial preparation is meticulous, the savings calculations, the pension documents, the budget adjustments, the plan. But the psychological preparation, the identity preparation, the honest reckoning with what it feels like to have the structure of a working life suddenly removed, that, almost universally, is absent. We plan for retirement as though it were a long and well-earned holiday. What many people discover, in that strange first year, is that it is something considerably more complicated than that. This is worth examining carefully, because the experience is genuinely common and genuinely underreported. It carries a particular kind of shame in a culture that treats retirement as the prize at the end of the race. You spent decades working toward this. The brochures show freedom. And here you are, feeling something closer to displacement, wondering if something is wrong with you specifically, when in fact the feeling belongs to the situation, not the person. Today we are going to sit with that honestly. We are going to look at how work became so central to identity in modern life, what it takes with it when it leaves, what the first year of retirement actually looks like for many people, and what both older human wisdom and lived experience can tell us about purpose when the framework that delivered it disappears. This is not a video about finding your passion, staying busy, or reinventing yourself. Those things have their place. But they are answers offered too quickly, before the question has been properly heard. The question deserves to be heard first. Because for many people, the question that retirement finally makes unavoidable is one they have been putting off for a very long time. Not deliberately, not out of cowardice, but because the work was always there, providing a sufficient answer, making the deeper question unnecessary. The work is gone now. The question remains, and sitting with it honestly, rather than running from it, may be one of the most important things a person can do in the second half of life. To understand why retirement can feel like a loss of self, you have to understand how work came to mean so much more than it used to. For most of human history, work was necessary in the plainest sense. You labored to eat, to survive, to maintain shelter, to protect a family. The meaning of work was largely external and practical. It was what you did because the alternative was hardship. Work was not, for most people through most of history, the place where you went to discover who you were. That began to change over the course of the 20th century, and it changed more sharply than most people recognize. The post-war economic expansion of the 1950s and 1960s created something historically unusual: a large, relatively stable middle class in which work came with benefits, pensions, career ladders, and the genuine possibility of advancement. Work became respectable, predictable, and in certain industries and professions, genuinely fulfilling. It was the mechanism by which a generation rebuilt lives after the disruption of the Depression and the war. It gave people not just income but dignity and purpose. It placed them in an organization, a trade, a company, a professional community, and that placement meant something. Then, across the 1970s and 1980s, something else entered the picture. The idea of work as self-expression, of finding a career that reflected who you were and what you cared about, began to move from the margins into the mainstream. Do what you love would eventually become ubiquitous advice, but the seeds were planted earlier. The notion that your career should match your inner self, should express something essential about you, began to reshape how people thought about what work was for. By the time today's retirees were in their prime working years, the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s, the fusion of work and identity was nearly complete, not just in the culture but in daily lived experience. You were your job, not in a crude way, but in a structural one. Your schedule was your employer's schedule. Your social world was largely your colleagues. Your sense of competence came from the skills your work called on. Your sense of mattering, your confidence that your presence in the world had some weight, came from the role your work assigned you. Even the language that people used about their working lives had changed. By the late 20th century, professionals were describing their careers not merely as what they did to earn a living, but as their purpose, their calling, their identity. And for many people, this was genuinely true. Not as self-deception, but as lived reality. The problem with that reality, the shadow side of it, only becomes visible from the other side of retirement. If work was not just work, if it was simultaneously identity, community, daily structure, status, and purpose, then losing it is not just losing income. It is losing the answer to nearly every fundamental question about who you are and where you belong. There is one thing more that work provides, quietly and without announcement, that most people do not appreciate until it is gone. It makes you necessary. Someone depends on you to show up. Your presence has consequences. Your skills are wanted. The fact of being needed is one of the most powerful anchors of psychological well-being that exists, and for decades, work delivered that anchor every working morning. It is also worth understanding what has changed in the surrounding world that used to cushion the retirement transition. Previous generations retired into environments that offered natural structure beyond the workplace. Grandchildren nearby, an active church or community organization, neighbors who were genuinely known. Many of those structures have thinned over the intervening decades. Geographic mobility has scattered families. Religious attendance has declined significantly since the midpoint of the last century. The informal neighborhood life, where you knew the names of the people on your street, where casual gathering was part of the rhythm of ordinary days, has largely receded. Which means that when work ends for many people today, it does not end into a warm and waiting world of community and alternative structure. It ends into quiet, and quiet, which sounds so appealing from inside the noise of a demanding working life, can become something quite different once it actually arrives and shows no signs of leaving. The research on what actually happens in the first years of retirement is illuminating, and not in the ways that retirement marketing tends to emphasize. The popular image is persistent and appealing. The couple on the sailboat, the golfer on the morning fairway, the grandparent reading in the garden. Those images describe real happiness for many people, and often, eventually, for most people who make the adjustment. But the first year, and sometimes the second, tells a different story more often than is publicly acknowledged. Studies have found elevated rates of depression and low-level anxiety among people in the immediate post-retirement period. Not crisis depression, typically. Not the kind that announces itself dramatically. More often a persistent flatness, a loss of motivation and energy that does not fit the image people had of this chapter. Some research suggests that a significant minority of retirees experience what might be described as an identity vacuum, a period of genuine confusion about who they are, what they contribute, and what makes the next morning worth beginning. The experience is more common among men, the research consistently suggests. This connects to something worth examining honestly. Men, across the generations currently retiring, have tended to define themselves more narrowly through their working and provider roles than women have. The question, "Who am I?" was, for many men, answered almost entirely by the job. When the job goes, the shelf feels empty. Women, who have often maintained richer webs of social connection, friendship, community involvement, and relational identity alongside their working lives, tend to have more to carry them through the transition. Men who were less attentive to those webs during the working years can find the retirement adjustment genuinely disorienting. But this is not only a story about men. Women who built careers that genuinely defined them, who derived real and deserved satisfaction from professional mastery and responsibility, can find themselves equally surprised by the sense of loss. The cultural script said that women who worked hard deserved to rest and should welcome the chance. What many discover is that they miss the work, or at least miss something the work provided that they did not know to name while they had it. The sense of competence, the daily confirmation that their skills mattered, the structure of a day pointed toward something. What is being lost is not always obvious from the outside. It is not only the schedule can be replaced with other activities. What is harder to replace is the daily, low-level feedback that you matter, that you are in the world, and that your presence has some effect on it. At work, even when things are difficult, there is a constant ambient confirmation that your existence is consequential. Problems arrive and you address them. Colleagues learn your rhythms and expect your input. Your name appears on things, emails, reports, decisions. You are known. You are in the current of things. Your departure, even temporarily, is noticed and felt. Retirement, for all its genuine gifts, can feel like stepping out of that current. The world flows on without you. The inbox, after a few weeks, goes silent. The calls from colleagues taper and stop. The institutional memory of your presence fades faster than you anticipated. And you sit in a home that is quiet and yours and comfortable, and wonder, in a way you had not expected, why the hours feel so long. This is the experience that almost no one prepares people for. Not because those who retired before us wished to conceal it, but because it is awkward to admit. It sounds ungrateful. You worked for 40 years toward this moment. Every responsible thing you did was pointed at this end. And now that it has arrived, you feel diminished? Uncertain? Not quite yourself? Those feelings carry shame in a culture that treats retirement as a reward, as the prize for a life of responsibility. So people tend not to voice them. They say, "I'm keeping busy," and "we've been traveling," and "it's an adjustment, but it's wonderful." And underneath those words, quietly, many people carry a question they have not yet found the right language for. A question they would not quite know how to ask, even if they found someone willing to listen. There is a philosopher named Viktor Frankl who spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He emerged from that experience with a clinical and philosophical conviction that he spent the rest of his life articulating. That the most fundamental human drive is not for pleasure, not for power, not even for safety, but for meaning. For a reason to exist. For the sense that this life, this particular life, points towards something beyond itself. Frankl observed something that others have recognized in less extreme circumstances, that the absence of meaning is often more painful than the presence of difficulty. People can endure extraordinary hardship, genuine suffering, real deprivation, when they understand what it is for. What becomes intolerable is not hardship. It is purposeless hardship, suffering that serves nothing, days that point nowhere. This insight has particular resonance when applied to the question of retirement, though Frankl himself wrote about it in other contexts. Work, for all its limitations and frustrations, has been a meaning delivery system. Not necessarily the deepest source of meaning available to a human life, not the meaning of love or family or faith or beauty, but a reliable, daily, practical answer to the question, what is this day for? When that answer is removed, the deeper questions do not simply appear in a welcoming and manageable way. They can arrive with a kind of blankness, a silence where the noise used to be. And in that silence, the self that was always present but always occupied can suddenly feel unfamiliar. The ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but more precisely understood as flourishing, as living well, as living in accordance with what you are genuinely capable of, was never a passive state. Aristotle, who explored it most fully, understood it as the activity of the soul in accordance with excellence. To live well, in this view, was not to rest but to engage. Not to consume but to create and contribute. The idea of flourishing as sustained leisure would have seemed incomplete to him, not because he thought rest was worthless, but because he understood that rest is only genuinely meaningful in relation to engagement. Rest from something. Rest in preparation for something. Rest as restoration. The person who sits in comfort, day after day, and gradually loses the sense that any of it is pointed toward anything. This is not what Aristotle meant by a life going well, regardless of how comfortable it looks from the outside. There is a Japanese concept that has received more attention in the West in recent years, ikigai, which translates roughly as reason for being. It points toward the intersection of four things: what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what you can receive some form of acknowledgement for. Western interpretations have tended to apply it primarily to career choices, to finding the right job. But the original concept is broader and more generous than that. Ikigai was not specifically about employment. It was about having a reason to rise in the morning that felt genuinely yours. Something that made your existence feel purposeful in a daily, embodied, concrete sense. The reason this concept has traveled so far and resonated so widely is simple. Many people know what it feels like to have it, and many people know what it feels like to lose it. Retirement, particularly when it arrives suddenly, or as the result of a health problem, or earlier than planned, can remove ikigai without any provision for what might replace it. So what does replace it? What have people who navigate this transition with genuine grace found to be true? The honest answer is that it varies. There is no universal prescription, and anyone offering one should be regarded with some suspicion. But patterns emerge among people who find their way through this without either filling every hour with distraction or retreating into a kind of resigned waiting. What tends to work, and this deserves to be said slowly and clearly, is not staying busy. Activity for its own sake is a way of avoiding the question rather than answering it. The person who fills every hour with errands and routine and television programs is not necessarily flourishing. They may simply be running from a silence they have not yet decided to face. The question is still there. They have become expert at not hearing it. What tends to work is some form of genuine contribution, which is different from activity. Not necessarily paid work. The old equation of contribution with income is part of what needs to change in how people think about the years after formal employment. But contribution in the sense of mattering to something beyond oneself. Something that would be slightly different, slightly less, if you were not there. The grandparent who is genuinely present for a grandchild's development, not just watching but engaged, interested, and intentional. The person who brings their professional skills to a community organization that cannot otherwise afford them. The neighbor who tends shared spaces. The volunteer who sits regularly with isolated older adults. What these people share is not busyness but investment. The sense that their effort shapes something outside themselves. What also tends to work is what might be called continuity of self. People who navigate retirement most gracefully often carry something of who they always genuinely were into the new phase, not their job title, not their professional status, but their real capacities and their real interests. The manager who loved the discipline of organization finds new places to organize. The teacher who loved explanation finds new people who need things explained. The doctor who found genuine satisfaction in understanding complex systems now reads widely and argues carefully with friends. The form changes. The self does not disappear, it relocates. And what helps enormously, more than is often planned for, is honesty. Not performing gratitude and smooth adjustment while quietly struggling, but allowing the difficulty to exist and to be named. The people who move through the first hard year most successfully tend to be those who found at least one person, a partner, a friend, a sibling, sometimes a therapist, with whom they could be truthful about how strange it feels. How unexpected, How the silence is bigger than they thought it would be. There is something about naming a thing that reduces its power over you. The feeling of disorientation, of lost identity, of not quite knowing who you are without the role that work provided. These things become more manageable when they are spoken rather than managed alone, in the privacy of a restless morning, in the quiet of a house that used to feel peaceful. There is no tidy solution to the end of work, no formula that resolves the question overnight. What there is a life to be lived on the other side of it, and that life, like every chapter of life, has to be built rather than assumed. The most honest framing of retirement may be this: it is not a reward for the years of labor behind you. It is a new phase of life, with its own demands and its own opportunities, that requires the same kind of attention and intention as every other phase. The person who arrives at 65 assuming that the rest will take care of itself often finds, to their genuine surprise, that it does not. The person who brings honesty and curiosity to the question of what this chapter is actually for, and who is willing to sit with the discomfort of not yet knowing, tends to find something worth living toward. That is not a small thing to say. Many people arrive at later life having spent decades carefully deferring the deeper questions. There was always a reason to put them off. The work was demanding. The family needed attention. The finances required focus. There would be time, later, for the questions that did not have practical urgency. Retirement is that later, and the questions have been waiting with considerable patience. What gives you a reason to wake up? Not an activity, not a distraction, not a way of passing the time pleasantly. A reason, something you care about, something you are genuinely a part of, something that would be slightly diminished in the world if you were not there. What have you always known how to do that still has somewhere to go? The capacities that decades of work called on do not vanish when the paycheck stops. The patience you built, the skill you developed, the knowledge that took years to accumulate, it is still there, available, waiting to be directed somewhere new. Who needs your presence? Not in a transactional way. Not because you owe anyone anything. But in the simple sense that your unhurried attention, given genuinely to another person or a situation, would make something better. The grandchild who needs someone calm and interested in a world full of hurry. The neighbor who has quietly stopped going out. The younger person navigating something difficult who needs the perspective that only experience can honestly provide. Presence is a form of contribution, and contribution is a form of meaning. The crisis of purpose that retirement can bring is real. It is not a sign of weakness in the people who experience it. It is a signal, from a self that is still alive, still interested in mattering, still looking for a place to be useful and known. That signal is not a problem to be suppressed with busyness. It is an invitation to be taken seriously. The older traditions, the philosophical ones, the ones carried in cultures that have thought longer and more carefully about what a complete human life looks like, understood something that modern retirement culture has tended to flatten. That purpose does not retire. The body slows. The circumstances change. The institutional structure that organized the days disappears. But the need to be genuinely engaged with something beyond the self, to feel that this day, this hour, this life is pointed towards something, does not diminish with age. If anything, as time becomes more visibly finite, that need becomes more insistent, not less. There is a quiet kind of courage involved in facing that honestly. In not pretending that staying busy is enough when something in you knows, clearly and without drama, that it isn't. In not filling every hour so that the silence never has a chance to speak. In sitting with the discomfort of not yet knowing what the next answer is, and trusting that the question itself, held seriously and lived with honestly, will eventually point the way. Work gave many people a place in the world for a very long time. That place has closed. What remains is the person who lived there, with everything they know, everything they are capable of, everything they have learned from the years of difficulty and accomplishment and ordinary daily life. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The question is what to do with it next. And that question, wherever it leads, is one worth taking as seriously as anything you have ever worked toward.